Welcome back, everybody, to your, no, well, not really daily, but since we're almost or mostly done celebrating that Middle Eastern's death cult's winter holiday, except you Orthodox people, you still have kind of time to wait for this. Anyway, since we're done celebrating that death cult, I figured it's time to talk about a different death cult, by which I mean the one of Kina, the Deceiver, or the Queen of Deceivers. Anyway, I'm finally back talking Black Company because I didn't do that for a long time, and now I took the holidays to reread She is the Darkness, Book 7 in the Chronicles of the Black Company. Possibly Book 8, depending on whether you count the Silver Spike or not. Anyway, let's sit down and have us a talk on it. This will be full of spoilers because, you know, it's the 7th or 8th book in a series that has been going on for a long time, has been out for a long time. I don't need to tell you to read this book. You already know that you need to read this book if you've made it this far, right? So we're going to talk about spoilers and stuff that I think make, once again, She is the Darkness a great novel. And, you know, once again, y'all should go and read Black Company. It's so underrated, it's criminal. Anyway, let's get started, right? Well, cheers. Also, I hope this still looks good or sounds halfway decent, because my tripod broke and this camera is currently piled on a bunch of CDs. Yeah, we'll see. I'll sort this stuff out eventually, just like my life and all the other things, he says, confidently. No, in all seriousness, let's get started with She is the Darkness. Now, this is part of the Books of the South. It's the not second to last, third to last novel. Those novels have certainly grown in length. This one is like almost double the size of, say, the first 2, maybe 3 Black Company novels. And it's a bit sprawling, a bit more sprawling in structure and whatnot. And that's sort of where I think I've heard people say that they feel like later novels in the series, especially the last 2 or 3, the writing kind of falls down or whatever, and I kind of see where this is coming from. So we've sort of ended it with, like, the last one, Bleak Seasons, being that weirdly structured one with the narrative of Mergen stuck in Dejagore and telling us the story through these several like layers of nested narratives and stuff. Now we're more or less back in the present, right? And we see the next step in that campaign of the Black Company against the Shadow Masters, or the last living Shadow Master, that being Long Shadow, all the way up there near the Shadow Gate and the Plain of Glittering Stone, which may or may not be the gate to Katovar, which is where the Black Company wants to go to. So basically, the overall structure of the campaign, and thus the novel, is straightforward. The Black Company marches south, takes over whatever, you know, takes over Shadowgate, or in this case, the Fortress of Overlook near the Shadowgate, to march on to Katovar. That's sort of the plan. Now we get a lot of things happening in that like broaden the horizon. We still have that ongoing conflict or not conflict with the Nuang Bao culture. There's that kind of cultural stuff going on. We have another element to give us different perspectives. I mean, this is still all told to us in like first-person narrative from our current analyst, that is Mergen, still. But to give us like all kinds of perspectives that are difficult to get because, you know, Mergen can't be everywhere, we have that device of Smoke, the wizard that is in a coma and that can be used to travel around in the spirit realm to look at stuff. That was introduced last novel, and it's used here in a lot of ways. And this, once again, is something that Glen Cook does masterfully, and not many fantasy authors in that regard have done. That is, introduce in a military fantasy novel. If you're trying to make it military modeled on contemporary military, like modern military, like the kind of stuff we deal with today, or like in the last century, there's a lot of technology that your typical medieval army doesn't have, right? Whether it comes to firearms or surveillance, airborne, like airplanes, that kind of stuff doesn't exist. Now, Glen Cook is, I would say, the pioneer of that. We see other authors like Stephen Erickson and Cam Esselmont with the Malazan Book of the Fallen pick up that idea. So where we have the qualls of the Moranth in the Malazan world, here we have these flying carpets, these weird flying carpets, and we had like some really high gadgety ones near the end of the White Rose, right, where those were basically bombers that you could use to drop all kinds of incendiaries on your enemies and shit like that near the end of the White Rose. Now we don't have that many of those carpets, but they still kind of exist as a magical gizmo or a bit of magic in the magic system that is obviously never explained in the Black Company, to model or give us similar technology or like similar effects or tools to a contemporary or modern army or to contemporary modern warfare, so we can implement those or include those into what is basically a war story, basically a military story. Another one is obviously the idea of spying in all kinds of ways, like through surveillance planes, what have you, flying over places, taking pictures, that kind of thing. And we get that through, flying around with smoke, or what you might call what they call ghost walking here. That's another one of those tools. Yet another one is firearms that we give here with those bamboo poles that could shoot like fireballs that Lady invents. First just to, fight shadows, but later on to also destroy buildings, which makes a lot of sense, right? So that's something that we get here, and that I feel can feel a bit weird, a bit off if you're not used to it, because your classic, epic fantasy, even your contemporary epic fantasies, your Robin Hobbs, even your Scott Lynch or Joe Abercrombie's or whatever, don't really go in that territory to just like take a modern invention and then kind of re-engineer it into a magical thing. That can feel a bit off or a bit cheap, but it kind of works here because it obviously has a specific thing that it is trying to do. And that is, once again, to tell a story in a fantasy guise, as a fantasy adventure, basically, but also impart some experiences and some knowledge, or what you want to call, experiences, I guess, of what it is to be a soldier in a modern warfare situation, or what it means to be a soldier, as opposed to what it means to be a warrior in a whatever kind of world, fantasy world or pseudo-medieval world, because those are very, very different things. The professional soldier is a very different beast altogether from your knight or your knight errant or your warrior. Your Aragorns and Boromirs are not the same as your Sergeants Whiskey Jacks or your Croakers, is what I'm trying to say here. And that's sort of a different thing, and to explain that feeling of the professional soldier, you need that kind of stuff. So you have your Moranth munitions and your Moranth qualls in the Malazan world, and you have your flying carpets, and you have your ghosts, and you have your bamboo poles that shoot fireballs and stuff to do that. And I think it makes a lot of sense, and once again, I would say that in a way, Glen Cook was blazing the trail for that kind of thing in fantasy literature. To, put those things in there so people can see, yes, it can be done. And then maybe other people will emulate it. Not that I'm saying that Cam Esselmont and Stephen Erickson weren't actively playing those kind of things long before She Is the Darkness actually was released. But, it sort of you know, these kind of things have to show up somewhere, and Glen Cook with the Black Company was in general certainly what you might call a trailblazer when it comes to military fantasy or all kinds of aspects of contemporary modern fantasy. We also have Glen Cook getting a bit cheeky on us here. There's one scene that I'm like laughing my ass off every single time I'm reading it, which is at some point someone quotes, when they're talking about fear, someone just like talks to Morgan's like, fear is the mind killer. To which he reacts with like, what kind of bull? Sounds like Uncle Doge's mystical bullshit. Like, yeah, you know what? You successfully made a Dune joke, and I'm glad for you because that's actually really, really clever and funny and really cool. Showing reference to Frank Herbert's Dune, and at the same time showing up that this is not a mystical story. This is very much a boots on the ground kind of story. Magic is a tool. Magic is not a religion or anything like that. And I just like really love that. Another aspect, now we've seen Glen Cook becoming more and more meta-fictional in some of the things he was pulling in the last book with those layers of narrative, with Mergen on like 3 time levels, I guess, kind of thing. And this time around, there's a wonderful scene that I really love, which is rather later in the novel, where Mergen has a conversation with Croker, and Croker is criticizing Mergen for the style of the annals. And it's super funny because obviously Croker was the analyst before, and those are, you know, those different books are very much written in different styles because Mergen's style is different than Croker's style, and Mergen is complaining to the reader about how Croker's books were also like short in description and so terse and whatnot. And that level of Glen Cook basically making fun of criticism of his work through having the authors, the fictitious authors of those different books, talking to each other about criticizing each other is just really funny. Especially when you also have the Book of Lady in there that is always commented on, like how she was trying to make herself look the best possible way and how things have to be redacted in those accounts. I just feel that this is something that, like, of course we have had at this point a lot, not a lot, but we have had a few fantasy stories with first-person narrators, and some of those were fairly unreliable. I mean, I'm thinking here of, obviously, your Book of the New Sun kind of thing. Severian is one of the most unreliable narrators in fantasy history, but it's made very clear that, like, it was always made clear from the beginning in those books of the Black Company that those narrators are also fairly unreliable. They write down what they see, how they see it, and stuff they don't know just doesn't show up. So if they don't understand magic, magic is not explained, and it's very clear that magic is never really fully explained. And Mergen even comments on it here. It's like, maybe sometime he'll actually get a wizard to sit down with him and explain that shit, but until then it's not going to go into the books because no one really knows about that kind of thing. So yeah, this is very much something that I really appreciate about the book. And like compared to the first kind of novel, it really shows how Glen Cook as a writer becomes more aware of these tools of writing to use, and use them more skillfully than just going straight ahead with that radical first-person narrative as he did in the first novels. And he uses all those tools, Mergen being able to float in his dreams, Mergen using ghost, other people using smoke, other people using it. That is that's all done really cleverly. There's a lot of other stuff also that I wanted to talk about that makes this book once again really good. As I said, the overall story is a bit messy, it's a bit all over the place. You have that campaign, you have the siege part at the Shadow Gate, you have them traveling near the end onto the plain, into that fortress. It almost feels at times like this could have been like two shorter novels if you take the campaign and the siege into two parts. That could probably have been done and, kept with the shorter format of previous books, but I feel it still works because it is sort of a cohesive thing. It kind of ends, it starts with them leaving Taglias, going to the south, and it ends with them on the plane. In that trap, but it kind of ends that whole that part where with them working for the rulers of Taglias. So that kind of makes sense. I'm just saying it can feel a bit messy. The other thing, obviously, is that talk about dense. This book packs a lot of events and actions. There's we've already spoken about this before, right? Like Glen Cook is not someone to go into extraordinary detail when it comes to how to describing the landscape and plants and what. He doesn't do that kind of thing. But it's still a long book, so there's a lot of stuff going down all the fucking time, right? There's action after action after action, and you're like, oh, I only have 50 pages left. What could possibly happen? And then they still go onto that fucking plane and have all these events there and get trapped under the castle. There's that kind of almost feel a bit overwhelming how much stuff actually happens in that book. And I kind of forgot. There was stuff going on in this book that I thought would happen in the next book or thought would happen in the book before, so I kind of underestimated how much stuff is going on in She is the Darkness. But overall, I was still very happy. And there's other things that I still appreciate that Glen Cook is bringing in over time that I think are interesting. One of them certainly is command structure, the paranoia and command structures. That's something that he has always played with, the idea that the common soldier is always expecting everyone in the officer corps to be complete idiots. The idea that the people giving them, even giving the generals their orders are probably even greater idiots. Which I assume, I don't know because I've never been a soldier, luckily, is sort of how all soldiers feel, I guess. But it's shown here again and again. It also, the idea that having power, being able to manipulate the kind of power that comes with being a wizard, makes people prone to be insane on a lot of levels. When you see all that backstabbing and infighting with all those different sorcerers and sorceresses, that's sort of what he makes even more prevalent here. I mean, it's always been part of the story. And when you think of it as a book about the experience of the common soldier on the ground, the idea of working for whatever kind of government and having all those different aspects of a government backstabbing and fighting for control of the army during a war, and what kind of effects that can have for the people on the ground in the front lines actually fighting the war, which is usually a very bad and devastating effect. That's sort of the kind of thing that Glen Cook can point out through the way he sets up his world here. And I feel it's important to have that, to know that kind of thing. I feel like there's 1, 2, 3 more things that we should talk about before we end this for today. One of them is definitely religion. One of them is the ongoing idea of mistrust, of cultural differences, and whatnot, as exemplified with the Nuang Bao. And the last one is, something else that I'll come back to in a second when my brain works again. Right, relationships and the likes. All right, so let's start with the religion part. Now, it's interesting because the world of the Black Company has always had gods somehow. They never play a role, right? We have Old Father Tree, who's maybe a god. We have ideas of the people worshipping all kinds of gods, especially down here in Taglias. In the books of the South, we have these different religions having religious conflicts. We also have something like the goddess Kina, who is obviously, very much a stand-in, or like a very much heavily inspired by the goddess Kali. I mean, we're pretty, like, let's just name it. It's basically Kali, just twisted into like a fantasy form. So it fits that fantasy world, which I'm fine with. Don't get me wrong. The interesting aspect here is, however, that we never really talk about like religion. We have a few more scraps on it here. How, on the one hand, religion, like how people on the ground, how soldiers on the ground. Keep in mind, with the Black Company, a lot of those people that are actually our narrators are foreigners in that part. Mergen is from up north. Croker is from somewhere up north compared to where they are right now. So they always have a foreigner and outsider's look on these kind of things. But the other thing, however, is that with, like, being mercenaries and traveling, they're always outsiders. Soldiers are a tribe unto themselves at the end of the day, which is, something that we also see in the Malazan books, for example. But what we also get here is the idea that soldiers find it difficult to actually be religious. They kind of accept that gods exist. They sometimes even pray, but formalized too much proselytizing and so forth, formalized religion goes very much against the experience of the soldier, which is a traumatic experience in general. It sucks being a soldier. That's sort of the idea that you get like hammered home in this book again and again. It's like people that become brethren of the Black Company are not normal by, societal standards. Those are either criminals or people with all kinds of trauma that flee those traumas to actually, get out of that. So they are all very much disillusioned, and while they may be spiritual in some way or another, believe in like higher powers, fates, or what have you, the very, very overt religiousness is something that just doesn't work well with being a soldier on the ground. That's sort of the point that Glen Cook is making here. Is that true? I don't know. If it is true, and if you take the Black Company stuff as something Glen Cook writes with his experience as an actual soldier in mind, it can be seen as a criticism of, whatever government you want to talk about, spewing Christian or whatever rhetoric when explaining when talking about their military. I mean, there's always that disconnect that the Black Company makes very clear between the actual armed forces on the one hand and the people employing them, that being the government, so to speak, on the other hand. There's always that disconnect, and if that government or those rulers in this case are using religious phrases and whatnot, it feels almost like an insult, because the people on the ground, while being spiritual, are not subscribing to that very, very specific type of proselytizing religion, which is something that I find interesting in this book. It was a bit more clearly put out this time around than in other books. So, yeah, there's that. Other things. This book is cruel. Maybe more so than some of the others. I mean, there's always been that darker streak in the Black Company. It's always made clear that those people are not morally good people. But there's a lot more torturing and people that are sort of innocent dying in this one. Collateral damage is much higher in this novel, and there is no, like, there's very little said on that. It's more like, yeah, we know this is not good, but on the other hand, it's war and someone has to do that kind of thing. It just happens, that sort of idea. And while this is something that I personally really have a problem with, like on a personal level, it's like I think collateral damage and torture are terrible. I feel that the lesson to be learned here, once again, is the one that it's easy to condemn these kind of things for people that are not in those extreme situations. Those are stress situations that may lead people to do stuff that us people sitting in our comfortable homes in safety will, condemn and deem impossible to do or immoral as fuck. And that's certainly sort of the point that I can see there. And I also do appreciate the fact that these books are not shying away from that, and are very much aiming to make the Black Company, make those soldiers seem, people that are doing whatever it takes to do their job, to survive, and so forth, but are not shying away. No one tries to, like, Glen Cook does not try to make these people appear better than they are there. Which then, as readers, makes us question, why do we still appreciate those characters? Do we identify with them, or do we not? How do we deal with those kind of things? And that's something that I personally, once again, that's the kind of thing that makes me read these books, and that makes me appreciate these books, is exactly that it makes me question myself and my sympathies for specific characters. Like, those are horrible people. Why do I still empathize with them? Why do I still feel with them? Why do I hope and fear for them, and so forth? What's wrong with me is the question that comes out of that, I guess. Once again, this book does that a lot because, the death toll is certainly rising. The numbers are rising. We have armies. We have thousands of people fighting here. We have hundreds of thousands of people here on the march that are used. Those armies are huge, and there's a lot of people dying in catastrophes, natural catastrophes, and in war, and starving, and whatnot. And that's certainly another thing. So yeah, the Nuang Bao. Now this is an interesting thing, and one that I'm not quite sure how to take. Now, we've spoken about that before, the Nuang Bao being the secretive culture that is living in a in a coastal area, it's usually called the swamp. And they were like part of the whole bit in Dejagore, and yeah. And our main character, Mergen, married one woman from that tribe, and the tribe, we have that whole conflict going on between that tribe not telling, keeping to themselves, and we have basically both sides being xenophobic to the other side and keeping stuff from each other, thinking of themselves as superior to the others, and so forth. And this becomes even more of an issue this time round when we find out that Osari, Mergen's wife, did not actually die, like we found out at the end of the last book, or thought at the end of the book. But in that situation, while Mergen was unconscious, she was taken away and got told that Mergen was dead, and she's living as a widow back in the swamp. We find out, and he finds out, and we once again have that questions like, why does that happen? Why do people do that? And while this is a fantasy world, it certainly kind of obviously plays into that whole situation that you have with soldiers of a occupying army, which the Black Company kind of is, even though they're not. It's a weird situation. Soldiers of a foreign army coming to a place, starting relationships, as will certainly happen with local people, and than having these very different societal norms, expectations, and so forth interfering with what you might call personal relationships. And Glen Cook doesn't shy away from that. Glen Cook doesn't even judge really on that. It's fairly clear that, both sides, in this case Sarah and Mergen, are unhappy with this. But it's also fairly clear that both sides, like larger sides, really are not happy with Mergen and Sarah being together. Like, the Black Company is not happy with the Nuang Bao. The Nuang Bao are not happy with the Black Company. There's obviously mystical background and mythological background going on there as well. But the idea of keeping secrets from each other, behaving shitty to each other, to keep that whole conflict, that whole cultural conflict, boiling all the time is something that happens throughout the book. And it's, once again, it's not openly criticized. It's clear that both sides are unhappy with this, but they keep on doing it, right? Mergen keeps, trying to goad Tai Day and the other guys in that group, and the Nuang Bao are, on the other hand, all the time trying to keep secrets from the Black Company. And it's, once again, I find it interesting how these books just showcase that part of human behavior without judging it at all. And it's up to the reader to take, any possible lessons from it that you can take. And that's I guess in general what makes reading The Black Company for me interesting, but can also make it difficult, I guess. Well, not difficult, but like it doesn't tell you what to think ever in any like way. And that's something that not many fantasy books do. That not many fantasy books are that open with that regard. Like a lot of your, like super dark, grimdark books pretend to not judge and show all of human cruelty. But if they're done well, there's some kind of like implication behind it that is shitty behavior. Black Company doesn't really do that. So it's probably more grimdark than a lot of grimdark in other ways. So let's look at like the last thing, which is relationships and stuff, and then like miscellaneous, and then we're done for today. Relationships. We have a few. Obviously, we have the one from Mergen and Sarah. And we have the one with Croker and Lady, which is rather complex. Well, they all are. And there's the budding relationship between Mergen's mother-in-law, Mother Gota, and One Eye. Now, One Eye is obviously a very specific character, and there is some form of very, very crude comedy going on there as well, I guess. That probably would not fly that easily in a book that would be released in the year 2020 or 2021, but I think it works. But the more interesting thing is that all these relationships are very much with mature people. Mergen, when he meets Sarah is already married. Her then husband is dying. Sarah has already had at least one child before she meets Mergen. Well, Lady is obviously a couple of centuries old before she meets Croker. That's their thing. But they're also growing old together. Croker's around 60 right now, probably. Who knows? Age is also a bit flexible in these books. But it's interesting to see that. And with One Eye and Mother Gota, it's even more like they're old. Both of them are old. And the fact, like, there's like a bunch of things that are out of there that I like. First of all, with Glen Cook, it seems like people fall in love. Love and relationships happen to all walks of, like, people of all walks of life and all, like, areas of, like, all ages. It's not something that happens to the young and beautiful. There's no young and beautiful people in these books at all. All right, there's also Cordy Mather and the Radisha, which is also a very interesting one. In general, we have a lot of, like, rather strong female characters in these books already. We have Lady, obviously we have the Radisha, we have Kisara, who will be even more strong, like, even more important as a character in coming books. Mother Gota is not exactly a strong female character, but the idea there is it's oftentimes those relationships very much start with the women in that area, and they are always, none of those are like very much your like fairy tale love story, your like cliche love story. They're all very weird things, and I appreciate that a lot because most relationships, most times people fall in love, it's not your average romance. It usually works in way more complicated, awkward, or whatever ways. And I appreciate the fact that this is exactly what Glen Cook shows us here again and again. There's like all these different aspects of it. There's that long, ongoing, weird love story between Croker and Lady, where they have to come to terms with the fact that Croker, while being the leader of the Black Company, is... I mean, Lady is still... She's like centuries older. She used to rule an entire empire, so she's probably the stronger part in that relationship. And, with Radisha and Cordy Mather, it's even more that, because he's sort of like just... Well, he's even called a boy toy from time to time, I think. There's those aspects. And once again, I feel it's interesting that this book, especially, I guess, kind of comes out more in this book because it is so sprawling. Something I've said before. It's a sprawling narrative. It has way more moving parts, picture, and characters than you might expect. Everyone shows up somewhere, sometimes for a moment, does something somewhere, and so forth. And yeah, that's sort of why it's interesting to have all these different aspects of like all these different relationships that are sort of forming on the edges of the Black Company. Plus, always obviously the questions like how do soldiers in a mercenary company that move from place to place deal with these kind of things? How do you keep a relationship going? Does that actually work? Because you're probably going to move somewhere else rather sooner than later. That kind of thing. And I do really, really enjoy how that is portrayed here. How it will be portrayed in the coming books is a different question, and we'll probably look at that rather sooner than later, because I don't plan to wait another couple of months before I read Water Sleeps. Now let's look at a few like more writing things that I appreciate about this book. There is that whole ongoing bit about the plane of glittering stone, that like looming evil, right? The whole idea of like if it's like something is stone, stone is silent, stone is dead. It is immortality of a sort, and it shows once again that Glen Cook is very good at writing prose. Something that I guess gets overlooked a lot of times, right? It's like, oh, it's like so short in descriptions, there's no world building, it's all like this radical like short sentences, first person kind of narrative. But there are like incredible metaphors and like descriptions put in there, sprinkled in there from time to time, and the way he picks up on that whole like if it like it is immortality of a sort kind of thing from time to time, and ends specific parts of the story with like that like almost poems, that kind of thing, and how that almost poem kind of thing about the plane of glittering stone is slowly moving forward that part of the narrative, like how things in that castle, in that fortress of glittering stone are, you know, escalating slowly. That's actually really, really good. That's done that's really well done. So yeah, just, you know, I just really appreciate that. That's really cool. What else? Yeah, Sleepy. Sleepy as a character is really interesting because it's not a transgender character in the contemporary sense, but it's still, we have a character that is very much thought of by everyone as a man because they decide to be a man, but apparently was at least born as a woman. And we'll see how that will change in the future. Is it just like disguised as a woman to enter a mercenary company? Probably not, because there have been, you know, officially female soldiers. So is there more to that? We will find out in the future. I'm just saying that for a you know, generally rather a male-dominated field like military fantasy, that's pretty fucking awesome, is what I'm saying here. So yeah, there's that. Is there more? Well, I don't know. I just feel like also the end, like the world building, once again, we have all these like random things popping up. There's that quick scene where Goblin is fighting a weird tentacle monster. It's like, yeah, where did that come from? And yeah, you don't have any explanations for that. It's just like a weird monster that comes out of the desert and then it gets killed, and that's that. We're done with that, which is really cool. Plus the whole like plane of glittering stone, that weird plane, that whole bit is just like, once again, really cool fantasy that goes way beyond, you know, what you also usually get in your average fantasy. This is far from like your medieval fantasy. This is far from a lot of your contemporary or like modern fantasy worlds to have like this like thing that completely breaks reality. It's like, yeah, there's a huge plane and it's full of these deadly shadows that kill people, but are apparently the victims of those shadows were created through torture in a religious war, which, holy shit. That world was already dark before the Black Company showed up. you know, you have all of that, and you suddenly have that whole like weird plane that maybe connects different worlds one to each to another, and you have that big fortress in the middle of it. It's like with that huge demon or whatever it is on a throne. It's like, yeah, that's Glen Cook has an amazing imagination that goes way beyond what usually like writers in fantasy in epic fantasy usually fetter their minds to, right? It's like we force a lot of times we force ourselves when writing or reading fantasy to something that is very, very close to our own world. We don't actually go out and use all the possibilities that words give us. Glen Cook doesn't care about that. He just goes all out and just does crazy shit whenever he feels like it, and I love that. Anyway, I think we've rambled enough for today. At the end of the day, go read this one as well. Read all the Black Company and then talk to me, because I want to talk more Black Company with everyone, because I love those books. I feel more people should read them and enjoy them, and then we can have us a conversation about it. And I'll be back talking about Water Sleeps, but Enemies Never Rest in the near future. And until then, cheers.